While on the campaign, Trump made a lot of promises, and two of his big promises were and the ending of drugs coming into the U.S., be it from sea or from land, and the ending of U.S. involvement in foreign wars, particularly the Ukraine war and the ending of the war in Israel. But this recent issue of Venezuela is putting those two in conflict. And it's simply because, one, Donald Trump's goal with Venezuela, as previously been stated, is to end the drugs coming into the U.S. He's used military technology and missiles to strike a whole bunch of boats that are carrying drugs that are coming into the U.S. He's done it, I think, how many times? I'm not sure. But he's done it like over 10 times, probably closer to 20 or 30. And this has been his goal for that. But now he's escalating that goal even further. And that is in the blockade of Venezuela. So recently, Trump ended up doing a full-on blockade in Venezuela. And he's been seizing a whole bunch of boats that are coming in, particularly oil tankers. And just recently, he seized the third one. U.S. still in pursuit of the third oil tanker off of Venezuela. U.S. Still in pursuit of a third oil tanker near Venezuela, according to U.S. official, as Donald Trump intensifies an oil blockade on Nicolas Maduro's government. So, this puts two of his goals in conflict. Because, one, he said no more foreign wars. And this right here, a blockade, can be seen as a incitement to a war. It's actually what incited Japan to attack us in World War II, because they thought, because of the embargo from the U.S. on oil from Japan and the blockade of them getting that oil from the U.S. is what led them to attack the U.S. as they needed those oil resources to continue their expansion in like China. So this can, in a way, be an act of war, or at least one that's going to antagonize a foreign nation into doing something. Into doing something that results in a war. And this goes directly against what he said for not getting involved in another war, while also trying to achieve his other goal. Because he said one of his goals, again, was the removal of drugs coming into the U.S. and removal of drug cartels. Now, Venezuela has been a major sponsor of those drug cartels. In fact, they have these. In fact, they've been doing it for a while now, as that's actually a decent a way that they get some money into their country. So, and the regime in there has been supporting it. So Trump's goal with this is to remove that regime, and that in the blockade is to try to get that regime to be removed in the first place, trying to pressure them even more. So those two goals are coming into conflict here. Now, do I entirely agree with Trump on those two goals in the first place? No. I honestly think U.S. involvement in foreign countries is good in certain cases, and is actually very beneficial. And I actually think this is one of a really good reason, a really good nation to actually intervene in. And there's three reasons for that. So the first reason is, again, the drugs. Second reason is the fact that they're the world's largest oil reserve, and the third reason is that they are right in our backyard, and they're a nation that's anti-U.S. and constantly a threat to the U.S. Not like a major threat, but a way that foreign countries like China or Russia could get a headway into the American hemisphere, into the Western hemisphere. So, that's why I think this is a good thing. So first I'll go into depth more into the attack on and the reason for the drugs. So, drugs have been a major thing in Venezuela. And one of the major ways they actually end up funding their own government. Because Venezuela is an incredibly poor country. Even though they used to be one of the richest, they are now incredibly poor. And due to the fact that they are incredibly poor, one of the only ways that they can actually think of to make a whole bunch of money, and it's pretty easily, is through selling drugs. And what they usually do is funnel this either through Colombia up to the U.S., through Mexico and Central America, or they do it through the through sending ships. And up to this point, the U.S. has had practically cut off the shipping route for those for the drugs that are coming in to the U.S. They've cut the shipping route off completely, as they've been bombing and destroying ships that leave Venezuela with drugs. This means that they have to they're now shifting their ways for them to actually get drugs to the U.S. to different routes. Example, going through Colombia, going through other nations, up to the U.S. And we can't really deal with that with boats. So the next step would be to pressure them into actually stopping this in a different way. And that is attacking actually a more valuable source of income for the government, and that is oil. And that leads me into the second point. Oil. Venezuela has the most oil reserves as a nation in the world. Larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than America, larger than Russia. They have a massive oil reserve. So, a lot of their income naturally comes from that oil. In fact, 58% of the national government's income comes from oil. And comes from oil and the production and selling that abroad. So if you cut that off, then that causes them to lose a whole bunch of money. A ton of money. And if the Maduro government can't actually get the money to actually fund, first of all, the senior military advisors and other military personnel, they might revolt. And also, if they can't get the money from the oil and sell it abroad, then the people might also revolt. Because one of the goals and one of the things that they do to actually keep people in line in a lot of these authoritarian nations is to actually give the people money. And usually that money comes from oil. And if they don't have any of that money from that oil, they can't give money to the people. And that means the people will be dissatisfied and they will actually more likely revolt. This is actually what stops people from Saudi Arabia revolting against their authoritarian regime there. It's the fact that they have no taxes and practically a lot of the needs is covered by the oil revenue. So the people there are satisfied enough to where they don't need to revolt, and they have a strong enough income to where they don't see the need to revolt. And this is how a lot of foreign nations actually keep people in their nation under control. Another thing that they do, obviously, is suppression. But still, if you don't have if the people are still getting bad, you're not going to be able to suppress them eventually. Let's look at what happened in the French Revolution. Even though you had a autocracy and a government that had at least pretty strong control over its people, they ended up getting revolts. Look at the Tsarist regime in Russia, in the Russian Revolution. If the people are dissatisfied enough, they will revolt anyways. So that's another thing that might pressure people to actually revolt against Venezuela. Additionally, with the oil, a lot of the oil in there is actually being extracted is using U.S. property. Because let's watch a video on actually Trump explaining why it's U.S. property.
Just a blockade. Not going to let anybody going through that shouldn't be going through. You remember they took all of our energy rights. They took all of our oil from not that long ago, and we want it back. But they took it. They illegally took it.
They did illegally take it. So within the Maduro regime, not Maduro, is his predecessor. When his predecessor ended up taking Venezuela to a socialist route in terms of economics, he ended up nationalizing a lot of U.S. property, and a lot of U.S. companies' oil refineries and oil extraction, oil drilling sites. And that means that they practically stole a lot of money from the U.S. In fact, I think it was around $2 billion at the time in private investments that were in Venezuela. And due to inflation, that would actually be worth around $4 billion today. So they practically stole a decent amount of money from the U.S. even though it's small compared to our actual economy, they did actually steal money from the U.S. So we actually do need some reparations for that. We do need to be paid for that, as they are the ones that end up stealing U.S. property. So that's a valid point from Trump here. They did actually steal stuff from the U.S. So that's another thing. We have actual grievances against Venezuela besides just the drugs. They did steal what would have been U.S. oil and the income that comes from it. So they did steal that. That's another grievance here. Let's continue watching the video.
Oh, Dan did a great job. I think he wants to go back to his show. Yeah.
Let's turn this up a little.
Getting land, oil rights, whatever we had, they took it away because we had a president that maybe wasn't watching. But they're not going to do that. We want it back.
Yeah, I believe at the time it was Clinton in charge. So, because it was 1998 when the Socialist Party ended up winning the election and ended up taking away a lot of property from U.S. companies that were in Venezuela. So, yeah, it was under Clinton that didn't really care about it. And then I believe Bush and... Was it Bush? Actually, no, it would have been Bush, wouldn't it have? It might have been Bush, but still, those presidents back then didn't actually do anything, and even though they needed to, because again, a lot of U.S. companies' property was lost there. So we do actually deserve the property and what comes from it too.
They took our oil rights. We had a lot of oil there. As you know, they threw our companies out, and we want it back.
So yeah, they did throw us out. They did steal our property, and we want it back. Additionally, another thing with this is that if the socialist regime didn't actually throw out U.S. companies, then we would actually have a lot more access to oil, and oil would also be cheaper. Because again, I mentioned earlier, Venezuela has the number one largest reserves in terms of oil. So if these U.S. companies were actually able to drill for oil there in the past, when their property was taken away, all the oil prices now would probably be less, and they would have been less in the past too. Maybe even under Biden, we wouldn't have seen a massive increase. Although I think that's from other policies, but still, if they did not do that, then all of our gas prices would be lower and it would be cheaper. So that's actually extremely important for there too. So overall, I think the oil case is that they have a tons of oil there, and we need to actually end up trying to get that oil back. They clearly stole property from us from U.S. companies and the U.S. people when they nationalized their industries, and they stole the property there. So this blockade is actually achieving a lot of goals too. Also, from the oil tanks, the fact that they also have oil on them, that means also the property on the oil tankers can actually be used in U.S. companies too. So we're practically also stealing back our oil from Venezuela. So that's another thing too. So overall, I think the blockade is probably effective. It's cutting off their oil supply. And cutting off their income from the oil supply, which is around 56% of their actual income in terms of government income, around 56%. So that's probably going to incentivize a whole bunch of stuff. It's going to make the people mad that they're not getting their dividend. It's going to cut off money to senior military in Venezuela. It's going to make it harder for the government to actually hold on to that. And then another thing is that we actually deserve the oil, as they did actually end up stealing property all the way back then, and we need that. We want that oil back. Additionally, with the fact when they actually open up and you get a change in regime there, then we'll actually see a massive decrease in oil prices too. As I kept mentioning, Venezuela has the number one world's largest reserves of oil. So since they have that very, very large reserve, if we end up doing a regime change, and regime change is more friendly to the U.S. and allows U.S. companies back into the country, then oil prices are going to go down because you have more supply. And basic supply and demand, more supply means less price. So this is going to be good for oil prices in the U.S. if Venezuela actually gets overturned. So I think this is a good move on that part. And then the third point, what was the third point I mentioned? So it's oil. This is how you know it's not scripted. So it's oil. It's national security. That was the other reason. So, Venezuela is one of the only socialist nations that is in the U.S. Hemisphere right now, and it's them and Cuba. So, since they are an anti-U.S. and they have an authoritarian government, they tend to be more sympathetic to other nations like China, like Russia, and with that, it makes it easier for there to be a headway into the U.S., the Western Hemisphere, and the American continent. If we allow there to be an authoritarian regime there. We actually saw this in the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Cuba ended up going communist, the USSR actually ended up stationing nuclear missiles there. And that actually ended up threatening the U.S. a lot too. That resulted in the Cuban Missile Crisis and actually almost led to World War III. As there was actually this fun story, not so fun story, of a Russian submarine that lost communication with Moscow, and if one person on the flight, one person in the submarine actually voted to launch nuclear missiles, we would have ended up in World War III. If they would have voted for that instead of not voting for it and waiting. So having this regime right here is actually threatening the U.S. too. As if a foreign nation like China, like Russia, came in and stationed something there, then it makes it, it threatens national security. Another thing with it is that, in terms of national security, is that currently they're actually a pretty weak state. They don't have a lot of support internationally right now. But in the future, when Russia and China actually become more powerful, they might actually send something over to to Venezuela, and that could result in issues because currently they don't really have a lot of support. They're harder to get to, but if somehow China or Russia became more powerful, they could have sneaked in military equipment. But because of the blockade that's going on right now, that actually cuts off a lot of the military equipment from even going in. Even if it wasn't an immediate threat, it stops a future threat. So I think this is also a good move in terms of national security. My only concern with this, however, is that this might actually end up the blockade and the destroying of ships will actually lead to a war with Venezuela. And that doesn't really scare me a lot, but it's a little bit worrying because I don't want there to be troops in Venezuela. But I actually don't think Trump's going to do that. First of all, he has used this tactic before with Iran. So he's been always anti-Iran and stuff like that. And when Israel ended up bombing Iran and destroying a lot of their capabilities, the U.S. actually helped them with that. And they actually did end up sending military in, but they only sent a B-2 bomber to destroy their nuclear facilities. So, this shows that Trump actually doesn't want any troops on the ground, but he'll use tactics like bombing raids and destruction of targeted facilities to actually achieve his goals. And I actually think that's what he might do. Another thing is why I'm not worried with war with Venezuela entirely, even though that they might declare it, is that they have a super weak military right now. Currently, they only have 21 fighters right now, fighter jets, compared to 2,650 U.S. Additionally, a lot of that old technology is like Su-30s and a couple of and only I think they have like 3 or 5 F-16s. That's super old technology. That's old technology. Even though it's reliable in a lot of ways, particularly F-15s, the Su-30s are not. And that means that they also are old technology, and they also have a lot of maintenance issues that they haven't been able to solve. Again, that's another thing where the blockade helps, is that if you have the blockade, you can't send in a lot of military equipment to actually repair that and get them prepared for war. So, that means their air force is really weak. And then all they also have in terms of Navy is that they have one frigate and one submarine. And then they have like 25 patrol boats. So they also have an incredibly small Navy too. So they can't really threaten the U.S. Military in the area at all. They're super weak in terms of Air Force and Navy. And if U.S. doesn't even send any troops into Venezuela, and they do a whole bunch of air raids and aerial attacks and naval attacks instead, Venezuela can't do anything. So it's not can't do anything to the U.S. really. So that means there's going to be no deaths, limited or no deaths on the U.S. side. So I actually don't think that's an entirely of a worry either with the Venezuela attacking. So I actually think this move from Trump is incredibly good because of those reasons. And I think that even if the worst case scenario of Maduro actually attacking and the regime doesn't change, I think we could actually end up using them attacking us, attacking actual military vessels as a way to retaliate them and just wipe them out completely. And that means that we can actually get it solved pretty easily too. So overall, I think that the U.S. in this situation with the blockade of oil tankers and the blockade of stuff will result in a positive change for the U.S. Less drugs, as mentioned earlier, with the fact that we're cutting that off, and a possible regime change leading to a state that doesn't actually support drugs. To the oil, we get our property back, and then we have more oil for the U.S., and it cuts off support for the Maduro regime. And then national security, it cuts off possible military aid from our foreign enemies, and it makes them weaker. So I actually think this blockade by Trump is a great move, and will actually end up benefiting the U.S. in the future. Hopefully it resolves quickly, but if it doesn't, I think this blockade's worth it. We get more oil, we get stuff. Another thing is, because of the blockade, we can also test out a whole bunch of our military equipment and get that into use too. So that's another side benefit. But overall, I think this is a good move from Trump because it pressures the regime even more. It makes it a lot easier for regime change, and it will benefit the U.S. in the future. So anyways, thanks so overall, I think Trump's doing a very good job on this, and I hope he continues doing a good job like this in the future. So anyway, thanks everyone for watching. Hope we'll see you later. Remember to like and share this one with everyone else, and I'll see you next time.